Hello, good morning and welcome to my channel and welcome to Devon in the southwest of England. Hope you're well wherever you are. Today I thought I'd talk to you about my experiences of leaving the UK and living abroad, and a little bit as well about returning to the UK because that's where I am now. And later I'll go for a little walk with you through a beautiful park to talk about some of the lessons learned from my experiences. But to begin with, I'll give you a little bit of background about myself and I'll tell you two stories. The first is about France and the second is about Germany. So the first story then. When I was in my 30s, I had young children. We lived in Buckinghamshire and we decided to start going on holiday to France. And the reason we did this was we wanted to be able to fill the car with all the kids' stuff. So put their toys in, their bikes, their scooters, all their games and things. And we wanted that freedom to simply set off in the car, get on the ferry and then drive through France. And I was pleasantly surprised at what we discovered. I'd only previously been to France maybe on city breaks or school trips, but once we started going on these kind of holidays, I began to fall in love with the country. And through these holidays I became obsessed with France. I loved the food, I loved the language, I loved the culture, and I became something of a Francophile. And I started learning French. I read novels that were set in France, and one year my mother and my stepfather met us on a holiday in Normandy and Brittany, and they were quite impulsive and they were quite convinced we were going to move to France. And by the end of the holiday they shocked us by buying a house in Normandy, and we were over the moon as well as being astonished by this, and they gave me a little bit of my dream for free. So we got really involved in their life in France. Every day I was on the phone to my mum, we were exchanging emails and pictures. We visited as often as we could, and I really felt like I was experiencing life in France through my mother and stepfather. And so I was naturally very happy about all of this, but my mum began to hate it, and she wasn't there very long before she really started to feel unhappy. So she expected life to be cheaper in France because, you know, they didn't have much money, and she expected to have more visitors than she did. So yes, I mean, the property's cheaper in France, and back then perhaps the cost of living was cheaper, and she was selling her house in the UK where property prices were much higher. So in theory she could have lived a more comfortable life financially in France, but it never worked out that way. And somehow or other, I don't know all the ins and outs of their finances, but somehow or other she ended up worse off financially. The second expectation she had was that she would get lots of visitors from England, because Normandy is not that far from England. However, where she lived was quite inaccessible. It was maybe 2 hours from the ferry terminal, and because it was not that easy to get to, really you couldn't go just for a weekend. And so what that meant was that because we live busy lives, then people, in order to visit her, had to sacrifice maybe their summer holiday. So consequently people just didn't visit her very often. She became quite lonely, quite isolated and quite depressed. So things started to get better after 6 to 9 months when she started taking French lessons in a local community hall, and there she met with lots of other British people who were living out there, And she became friends with some of these people. They went on little trips together, they did hiking together, and she went to parties round in at their houses, to barbecues and things like that. So she started to have more of a social life. She also met some of the local French people. They became quite pally with the mayor and his wife, and through them they started attending lots of local French events. She even appeared in the newspaper a couple of times, and she went to the wedding of the mayor's daughter. So she started to experience some of the real French culture and French way of living. And I had this feeling that if she had stuck with it for a little bit longer, she might have settled in and might have made that her home. However, she missed her family a great deal. She felt like she was missing out on her grandchildren growing up, and she was set on returning to England. So she ended up staying out there for a total of 16 months. And when she went back to the UK, she was worse off financially than before she'd left for France. And her financial struggles were a theme throughout the remaining years of her life. So it was kind of a happy, sad story. And I never managed to move to France myself. The kind of work I do requires me to be able to communicate with people. I'm not a tradesman. I work in an office type environment, and my French was never good enough to be able to get a job in France. So I never managed to move there, and after a few years of trying, we gave up and decided we would stay in the UK. A few years later, so in 2009, my wife and 2 children and myself, we moved to Germany. And that was an amazing experience. I could literally write a book on this. So I've got to try and keep this fairly short and brief for you. But the move to Germany, I would say, was divided into 3 chapters. So the first chapter was where we put the children into German schools, and we began a really exciting adventure, but we also went through all the challenges of integrating into German society, and the biggest difficulty of all was supporting our children through the German education system. But we stuck with it for almost 6 years, and I was very proud of us, and in particular proud of our children for that. But then my children, for various reasons, decided they wanted to go back to England to continue their education. They'd had enough of the struggle in Germany, and my wife came back with them as well. But I needed to stay in Germany for work reasons. So the second chapter of our life was my wife and 2 children living in England, me living alone in Germany. And whilst I got to come back to England every 2 months for 1 week at a time, I spent long periods of my life alone, and I had a real issue with loneliness, rather like my mum did in France. I also became quite depressed, and I started to live a fairly unhealthy life, living on takeaways and drinking too much, and generally feeling a bit lost in life. However, time takes care of all our problems. So at the end of that period, my children had left university, left school. They started to have their own goals and needs in life, and we realised it was a good opportunity for my wife to return to Germany so that at least the 2 of us could be together. And this coincided with Brexit, and Brexit was very difficult for us because it caused a lot of confusion. We were really unsure how things were going to unfold because there was a lot of political uncertainty, a lot of political debate. And you'll probably remember that it dragged on for a long period of time whilst there was all sorts of fallout in government, and no one really knew where we were heading with that. And because we were living on the two different sides of all of this. So we were living in Britain, but we were also living in the EU. We didn't know how it was going to affect us. So it made a lot of sense for my wife to return to Germany. So then we had a situation where we had one daughter on the south coast of England, one daughter in London, and us living in the west of Germany in Bonn. And then after a few months, my eldest daughter decided to leave London and she went to live in Berlin. So then we were quite spread out. I always wanted us to live close together so that we could pop round and see each other, so we could support each other through life's difficulties, so we could be involved in each other's lives. But things didn't work out that way. Yeah, so that just illustrates a little bit of the complexity of life when you move abroad. I mean, you know, life is messy and complex anyway, wherever you live. You know, I'm not saying our life would have been simple and straightforward if we'd stayed in England, but living abroad added another layer of complexity to our lives. And now, after all of that, my wife and I have returned to live in the UK. We're not in the same place as our younger daughter, but we're just a couple of hours away, so now we get to see a lot more of her. But obviously we get to see a lot less of our older daughter in Berlin. But I don't think she will stay in Berlin, so we'll see what happens with her and where she ends up. But that just goes to show that you may be one family, but you're also four individuals, each with your own needs, your own goals in life. And if you value living in close proximity to other family members, then living abroad can create some real difficulties around that desire. So yeah, so that's it. That's our story so far. We're not finished yet because we've come back to England and we're still trying it. We've only been back here for 5 or 6 months. I don't know whether we'll stay here permanently, but at the moment I am loving life here. So we'll see what unfolds. Right, so now I'm out on a little walk in our park. I hope you'll enjoy seeing some of the nature and scenery that we'll be walking through. Really is a special little place, this, as you will see in a moment. And whilst I'm walking, I thought I would share with you a few more little stories and insights and lessons learnt from my experiences of living abroad and indeed returning to the UK as well to live, actually. It's not a comprehensive list of everything I've learned and everything I've experienced, but just a few things that stand out for me as I reflect on this. So the first thing I would say is, if you're looking at moving abroad, get to know the country before you move, and ideally fall in love with that country. So what you'll find is that living in a country is a lot different to going on holiday there. So spend as much time as you can there, do as much research as you can, watch YouTube videos, read books, talk to people who have lived out there. Do whatever you can to discover as much as possible before you make that big move. And I know that's probably an obvious thing to say, but it's really important. And when I was looking at moving to Germany, I was lucky. I was working for a German company, so I started mixing with German colleagues. I got talking to them. I went out there on business trips, and I really got a good feel for the place, so that instinctively I knew it was going to be a good move. I knew I wasn't going to regret it. Of course, I also took my family out there on a couple of occasions to look at the city of Bonn, where we were going to live, and even we arranged for the kids to have, I think it was one day in the school that we were going to put them in. So they had these visits out there. They got to know the country. We also arranged for them to have German lessons in Aylesbury, which was a town near where we lived. So they were having all these lessons and learning about German culture before we even arrived there. And then we were able to make a family decision whether or not to take the plunge. So I'd really recommend you do that. I mean, that's part of the fun of it, I would say, is that initial sort of phase of exploring and getting to know the country and figuring out whether it's right for you. When we were looking to move to Spain, I found a British shop in the town we were looking at, and I went in, and the cashier was British, and I got talking to her, and I said, have you got any tips for someone like me who's looking to live here? And she said, yeah, rent before you buy. She said this town is very different in the winter to what it is in the summer. So in the summer it's busy, there are lots of people here, lots of tourists. All the cafes and restaurants and shops are bustling, and there's a lot going on, and the weather is hot and beautiful, and the days are long, and you can spend time on the beach. Whereas in the winter it's the opposite. So it's quiet. A lot of the shops and cafes and restaurants close for the winter season. It's colder than you might think, even though it's Spain, and the houses aren't well insulated, and they don't have radiators, for example, so it can be quite unpleasant staying in property during the winter in this Spanish town. So she said before you make any big commitments, she would recommend to rent there for 12 months and then make a decision at the end of it. And I thought that was really good advice. And if you think about it, the big things that you do before you make that full commitment, it might be you're selling a house here in the UK, it might be you're selling your business, it might be you're giving up your job or giving up your only source of income, it might be you're pulling your children out of school. So all of those massive things that you do in life, before you do them, be as sure as you can that where you're going is going to be right for you. And you can never be totally sure, you always have to take some risk, but do as much as you can to be sure the place is a good fit for you and your family before you take the plunge. Okay, we'll walk a bit further now, and I'll head towards a community garden, which is rather nice, and I'm sure you'll love it. Okay, the next thing I would say concerns expectations. So part of the reason I'm making this video is the YouTube algorithm has been recommending a lot of videos for me to watch that are about British people who are disillusioned with Great Britain. They're unhappy, they feel it is letting them down, and they're looking for a new life abroad. And I get that. Of course, you know, I didn't move abroad out of desperation. You know, when I lived in the UK, I was a homeowner, I had a good job, kids were in good schools. So I made the move more based on a desire to experience something wonderful in life, and I also saw some opportunities for us to grow and develop as people. So I did it for positive reasons, or we did it for positive reasons, but it also happened to coincide with the financial crash that happened in 2008, I think, and so I also saw some, it's all right, I'm not sure where I'm going here, I'm just looking. I also saw some benefits of moving abroad from a financial perspective and from a job perspective. So I think what I would say to you is be clear about why you're moving and why you want to move country, and be clear about what you expect from this and test out those expectations. Are they realistic? I think you should go into something like this with a sense of optimism, but also a sense of realism. And in terms of Britain, you know, I might be in a beautiful place now, and it really is beautiful, but I am aware that I wouldn't need to travel far from here to find signs of deprivation and people really struggling. Maybe they're sleeping rough or have awful jobs or are just really in quite desperate situations. And so I understand why someone would want to escape from all of this. But what I can tell you based on my experiences of living in Europe is Britain isn't the only country that's struggling. You know, if you look at the housing situation, yes, we have a housing crisis in the UK. It's almost impossible for many people to afford to buy their own home. And it's often a really bad experience to rent here. But if you look at Spain, Portugal, Germany even, those countries also have problems. So don't assume that moving abroad is going to fix your problems that you might be experiencing in Britain, because many of the problems that we face are universal. We have some global challenges, and if you look at things like the advancement of technology, that is disrupting people's lives across the world no matter where you live. If you look at the geopolitical environment that we live in, you know, sometimes it feels to me like the big countries, or some of the big countries, are trying to create a world that works for them whilst leaving smaller countries like ours to feed on the scraps. And okay, that might sound a bit dramatic, and it might, you know, it is just a feeling I have. And I'm sure people would argue against that. But certainly since the UK left the EU, we are now a smaller nation, and it is harder for us to exert our influence on the world and to create a set of economic circumstances that benefit us. So we're struggling, but many other countries are struggling too, and the EU is struggling, by the way. So we're not alone in this. Anyway, I'm now going to go inside this walled garden. It's a community garden, really very special. And that leads on to another point, I would say, and that is, if you're going to move to another country with your family, perhaps you can agree some milestones when you will review the situation, so that you have a possibility to return if things aren't working out the way you would have liked. So my wife and I returned to the UK 5 months ago, and we agreed we would come back here and try it for 12 months. And at the end of those 12 months, we will make a decision whether we stay here or whether we go to somewhere else like Portugal or Spain. I think that's really important, because it's easy to allow time to drift, and suddenly you wake up one day and realise you've been living somewhere 10 years and it's really hard to go back. And the longer you live in another country, the harder it is to leave and to return home, because you become more and more embedded in that country, and the country you left has changed more and more. So yeah, so maybe think about some milestones if you're a family. Perhaps the milestone could be when your child is due to start school, or when your children are due to move from the small school to the big school, or perhaps it's when you finish work. Whatever it is, maybe there are some milestones that you can agree with your family that you will reflect on how things are going and have that option there to return. And even then, of course, returning might not be easy, but it's about managing expectations within the family. So I hope I'm not putting you off moving abroad. I hope I'm not sounding too negative. I can assure you that there's a lot of really positive things, and it's just an amazing experience. But as I say, it's important to be realistic. And what I observed living in Germany was there were, of the British people that lived there, they fell into 3 categories. And I probably knew about 15 people, so it's a small sample. It might not be totally accurate, but it's just my observation. So the first category of people were families who were all English or all British, and they stayed out there. We were one of those. So we all stayed out there for a certain length of time. It ranged from about 3 years to about 15 years. We were 15, but I know some who came back after 3. But all of those families came back to live in England. Then there was a second category of people. They were British people who lived in Germany, but they were married to a German. And they have stayed out there permanently. So there's a lesson learned there that it's easier to integrate when you are married to a local person, because they can help you with the language. You have more opportunity to practice the language. They can help you with all the administrative stuff, like doing your tax returns. And they can help the kids with things like school homework. Plus, they introduce you to local people who are more likely to stay in the area. So you have access to a more stable background, I would say. Then the third category of people that I know are British people who moved to Germany when they were young. And they're similar to the ones who are married to German people. So they're completely fluent in German. They have grown up in German society, and Germany is their home. And Great Britain is some strange foreign place well, no, they do have some attachment to Britain, so but yeah, so that just, I think I mentioned these 3 categories of people just to give you a little sort of insight into how difficult it is to integrate when you move abroad. Of course, living in Germany, or living in the part of Germany that we live, would be different to living, I don't know, on a Mediterranean coastal resort, for example. Where I lived, people moved there in order to work. It wasn't a holiday resort. There's one thing I forgot, so sorry about this. There's one thing I forgot which is really important. And that concerns your kids. So if you're thinking of moving abroad with your children, then there's just a couple of things I would say. First of all, if you're moving to a country where they speak a different language to you, then it is much easier to move when your children are young. So I moved to Germany when my children were almost 10 and almost 13, and really that was too late. If you go before they're 5, then they just learn the language through playing, and they have no inhibitions, and they just throw themselves into it and take it in their stride. Whereas if you take them like I did when they're teenagers, or at least our oldest one was a teenager, then they have all that anxiety that teenagers have, all those concerns about what other people will think of them. You get all the teasing about their accents and all that sort of thing. Because they were focused so much on just learning the language, we had to get them private lessons in maths so they didn't fall behind with their maths, private lessons with the sciences, and ultimately we ended up putting our eldest daughter in our private international English speaking school. So not only do you need to put aside time to make them your number one priority, you have to put aside money. If we'd thought about this from a rational perspective, we probably wouldn't. Some might argue we shouldn't have moved abroad because our children were too old, and it was too much of a challenge for them, and it was unfair of us as parents to put them through that. However, our hearts were set on an adventure. We were motivated and passionate about the possibilities that lay ahead, and so we decided to do it. But it wasn't easy, and it came at a cost. We have no regrets whatsoever. Our children have no regrets whatsoever. Both of my children now have a university degree, which I'm incredibly proud of, and as they collected their certificate during the graduation ceremonies, I of course reflected on the unconventional path that we'd put them on. It's been a long journey, almost moving to France, then moving to Germany, where I lived through 3 very different chapters of my life. As I approached retirement, we began a 5-year search for our place in the world, exploring Portugal, Spain, France, and finally deciding on a return to England. Not the same place in England, but close enough to feel familiar and yet new. Along the way, I discovered more of my potential, becoming someone very different from the young man who left England all those years ago, and perhaps more like the person I always wanted to be. Maybe that's what this journey has really been about, stepping into the unknown in search of adventure, growth and meaning, and finding in the end something that feels right. So now I will say goodbye. Sorry that I added on a couple of extra points that I'd forgotten about, but I think they were worth mentioning. Yep, so I'm now going to go back and have a coffee and relax for the rest of the morning. So I hope you're well wherever you are. Take care of yourselves, and I'll upload another video soon. Thanks then, bye.